Welcome back to the show. Today we are setting out on a very specific type of investigation.
We are.
Usually when we talk about a biography, we're talking about a person.
Yeah.
You know, a president, an inventor, a
A
revolutionary.
single life.
Exactly. But today we're tracing the biography of a concept. It's a word that you hear constantly. It's in marketing meetings, it's in political commentary, and it is certainly at the family dinner table. I'm talking about the concept of a generation.
It's become ubiquitous. Boomers, Zoomers, millennials.
Right. Boomers versus Zoomers, the plight of millennials, Gen X being the latchkey kids. It has become this dominant lens through which we view our society.
It has indeed. It's one of the primary ways we categorize large groups of people today. It serves as a kind of shorthand for understanding cultural shifts, even economic behaviors.
A shorthand. That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And so the mission for this discussion is to look at where this idea actually came from. We want to understand its roots, starting all the way back with its ancient etymological roots.
And then moving forward in time.
Yes. Moving through its intellectual birth in the 19th century, which is a fascinating period we'll spend some time on, and following it all the way to the current status it holds in sociology. And, perhaps most importantly, we need to address the criticism it faces right now.
Which is significant. We're seeing a real shift in how social scientists are viewing these labels.
We are. We should clarify that our source material for this analysis is strictly drawn from demographic research, sociological documentation, and historical records regarding the social sciences.
That's correct. It's all based on factual documentation and research.
So let's start at the very, very beginning. The word itself, generation. It feels like it's always been with us, but the way we use it is relatively new.
That's true. Etymologically, the word comes from the Latin generare,
Generare,
which simply means to beget.
to beget.
Yeah.
So it's about creation. It's about the act of bringing something into existence.
That's the root. And when we look at the research, it's crucial that we distinguish between three very distinct types of generations. This is where a lot of the confusion lies in casual conversation.
Okay.
First, you have the familial generation.
The familiar one.
This is the structural relationship. Parent, child, grandparent. It's a step in a line of descent. It has nothing to do with the year you were born in a broad sense, and everything to do with who your parents are.
Right. That's the one we all understand intuitively. I am one generation removed from my father, two from my grandfather. It's a ladder.
Precisely. Then you have the biological generation. In biology, this refers to biogenesis, reproduction, and procreation.
Okay, so a bit more technical.
It is. In human demographics, the generation length is generally considered to be about 20 to 30 years.
Well, what does that number mean? Exactly. 20 to 30 years.
That's the average period during which children are born, grow up, become adults, and then begin to have children of their own. It's the cycle of reproduction.
And I noticed in the data that this biological timeline isn't static. I found that really interesting. It has actually shifted over time. We tend to think of biology as, fixed, but human behavior changes the math.
It has. In developed nations, the average familial generation length is now in the high 20s. It's even reached 30 years in some nations.
30 years. That's a big jump from 20.
A very big jump. And the documentation attributes this to a few key factors. Industrialization, a demand for cheap labor, which altered family dynamics, urbanization, and significantly delayed first pregnancy.
Which just makes sense. As education levels rise and economic structures change, people wait longer to have kids. If you need a master's degree to get a good job, you probably aren't starting a family at 20.
You're starting at 30 or even later.
Right.
The research highlights women's educational attainment as a key variable here. The more education women receive, the later they tend to have their first child.
And what about in less developed nations?
Conversely, in those nations, that generation length has changed very little. It remains in the low 20s.
So we have the familial and the biological. But the third one, the social generation, that's what we're really here to discuss today.
Yes.
This is the concept of a cohort of people born in the same range who share cultural experiences.
Okay.
This is the generation of Generation X, or the greatest generation.
Yes, a social generation is defined as a cohort of people born in the same date range who share similar cultural experiences. And while you can find hints of this idea in ancient literature, it really did not gain currency in the sense that we use it today until the 19th century.
That is a fascinating detail.
Yeah.
So before the 1800s, if you said generation, you almost exclusively meant your family kin.
Your lineage.
You didn't look at a group of strangers on the street and say, we are of the same generation. You looked at your village, your clan, your family line. The idea that you shared some kind of bond with everyone else born in, say, 1750 was not really a concept.
That's accurate. The shift is often pinpointed to a specific year, 1863.
Okay. What happened in 1863?
The French lexicographer, Émile Lecce, defined a generation as, and I quote, all people coexisting in society at any given time.
All people coexisting in society.
It was a broadening of the term. It moved from the private family sphere to the public social sphere.
That's a huge leap. So let's unpack that 19th century context. Why did this idea emerge then? Why not in the 1600s or the 1200s?
The conditions weren't right.
The mid-18th to 19th century was a time of massive upheaval in Europe. We're talking about modernization, industrialization, westernization. The face of the continent was changing completely.
And the economic structure of society was the primary driver of this new way of thinking.
How so?
Because of rapid social and economic change, young men particularly were becoming less beholden to their fathers and family authority than they had been in agrarian societies.
Right. Let's paint that picture for a moment. If you're a farmer in 1500, you need your father to inherit the land.
Your entire livelihood is tied to him.
Exactly. You need his knowledge to know when to plant the crops, how to manage the livestock. His authority is absolute because your survival depends on it.
But then came the Industrial Revolution.
And suddenly you could move to the city. You could get a job in a factory. Your economic survival didn't depend on pleasing your parents anymore. You had your own wage.
Precisely. Greater social and economic mobility allowed them to flout that authority to a much greater extent than ever before.
And it wasn't just about money, was it? There was this other factor. The skills of the older generation were becoming less valuable.
That's a critical point. It was because of the rapid pace of technological change.
So if the technology of the world changes drastically within 20 years, your father's advice about how to be a blacksmith or a cooper is suddenly obsolete, and that creates a rift.
It does, a fundamental discontinuity between the lived experience of the young and the old.
That's a crucial point. Discontinuity. When society moves slowly, the old teach the young. When society moves at breakneck speed, the old are seen as outdated.
The young look at the old and say, you don't understand how the world works anymore.
And there was also a shift in how people identified themselves. The research mentions a breakdown of regional identification.
Yes. The spread of nationalism, which was supported by things like a national press, linguistic homogenization, and public education.
So, a national identity.
It encouraged a broader sense of belonging. People stopped thinking of themselves just as members of a local village or a valley and started seeing themselves as part of a larger thing called society.
A nation. And within that larger society, they started seeing youth as a distinct category, a force of its own.
This was heavily influenced by Enlightenment ideas, the idea that civilization wasn't static, that it could progress.
And progress requires new ideas.
Yes. This encouraged the equation of youth with social renewal, and you see this reflected in the political rhetoric of the time. You had movements popping up all over Europe.
Like what?
Young Italy, Young Germany, the literary movement in Germany known as Sturm und Drang, which translates to storm and stress.
So you have this bubbling cauldron of youth rebellion, rapid technological change, new economic freedom. It's in this context that we get the first serious philosophical attempt to study this.
Auguste Comte.
Auguste Comte. He's considered the first philosopher to really systematically study generations.
Yes. In his Cours de philosophie positive, he suggested that social change is fundamentally determined by generational change.
Okay, so what was his theory?
His theory was that as a generation ages, their instinct of social conservation gets stronger.
Their desire to keep things the same.
Exactly. And this inevitably brings them into conflict with what he called the normal attribute of youth, which is innovation.
So conflict is just built into the system. The old want to conserve, the young want to innovate. It's a tale as old as time. But Comte was the first to really map it out sociologically.
He was.
He basically argued that death is necessary for progress. If the old didn't die, their conservatism would stifle all innovation and society would stagnate.
That is the essence of his argument. He saw generational succession as the engine of human progress. However, the theory really matures with a man named Karl Mannheim.
Karl Mannheim. He is the seminal figure in this field. If you study the sociology of generations, you start with Mannheim.
Without question.
He published a very influential essay in 1923 titled The Problem of Generations.
He did, and in this essay, he really pushes back against the way people were thinking about history at the time. He identified two schools of thought he disagreed with.
What were they?
First, the positivists. They measured social change in designated lifespans. Mannheim felt this reduced history to just a chronological table.
So just numbers on a page. Generation 1, Generation 2?
Too simplistic. The second school was the romantic historical school, which he felt focused too much on individual qualitative experience and couldn't explain broader social phenomena.
So he wanted something in the middle, something that was more than just a timeline, but more structured than just individual stories.
Exactly. And to do this, he introduced this concept of location, or Lagerung, in the original German.
Okay.
He argued that just being born at the same time is not enough to make you part of a generation.
Right. So just because we share a birth year doesn't mean we're in it together.
Correct. Mannheim elaborated that chronological contemporaneity is not enough, and he used a very specific example to make his point.
Which was?
He said to consider young people in China and young people in Germany in the year 1800.
Okay, so they're the same age, they share a birth year.
But, he argued, they did not share a generational location.
Because they weren't experiencing the same events. The young man in Germany might be dealing with the Napoleonic Wars or the early industrial shifts.
While the young person in China is living in a completely different social structure under the Qing dynasty.
They're peers in time, but they're strangers in experience.
Exactly. They were not in a position to participate in the same historical and cultural data. So Mannheim outlined 3 requirements for what makes a true generation.
3 requirements. Let's break them down.
First, shared temporal location. That's the easy one, being born at the same time.
Okay.
Second, shared historical location. This means exposure to a common era and its events.
So living through the same stuff.
Yes. And third, and this is the most important one, shared sociocultural location. He called this a stratified consciousness.
A stratified consciousness. That sounds a bit academic. What does it mean?
It means that the shared experiences lead to a shared way of thinking, a shared worldview that distinguishes that group from others.
So this is the key.
Yeah.
This is what's known as the imprint hypothesis, right?
Yes. The imprint hypothesis suggests that generations are produced by specific major historical events, things like wars, pandemics, economic crashes.
Things that shake up the world.
And these events cause young people to perceive the world differently than their elders. These events leave a permanent mark, or an imprint, on the cohort during their formative years.
And the timing of that imprint really matters.
Critically.
If I experience a major war when I'm 50, it's a terrible event, but my worldview is already pretty well formed.
Your fundamental assumptions about the world are set.
But if I experience that same war when I am 18, it defines who I am. It shapes my politics, my spending habits, my trust in institutions, everything.
That's the core of the theory. The fresh contact with society happens in youth, and that is when the imprint occurs. It forms a lens through which that cohort will view the world for the rest of their lives.
So, fast forwarding to the modern American context, we've taken this academic theory, Mannheim's theory, and in true American fashion, we've commercialized it.
We have.
We have to talk about Strauss and Howe.
William Strauss and Neil Howe. They developed the Strauss-Howe generational theory, which became incredibly popular outside of academia.
They did, and this is where we get the idea of the cycle.
They utilize what is known as the pulse rate hypothesis.
Pulse rate.
It's the idea that society is divided into these non-overlapping cohorts that create a repeating cycle of history. Each cohort, they argue, develops a unique peer personality.
And this theory just exploded in popularity. It really birthed the industry we see today. If you go into a corporate training session and they're teaching you about the 4 types of employees, it's often derived from this kind of thinking.
It did. It led to an entire industry of consulting, publishing, and marketing based on these generational archetypes.
And the numbers are pretty staggering.
To give you a sense of the scale, corporations spent approximately $70 million on generational consulting in the U.S. alone in 2015.
$70 million. That's a lot of money spent trying to figure out how to talk to millennials or manage Gen Xers. But I know that academically, Strauss and Howe are viewed with some skepticism.
That is putting it mildly. Social scientists generally reject the pulse rate hypothesis.
Why? What's the main criticism?
The main criticism is that it lacks statistical rigor, and more importantly, it's deterministic.
Deterministic meaning it claims the future is already written.
Precisely. It claims the future must follow a set cycle, which history rarely actually does. Academic sociologists much prefer the imprint hypothesis we discussed earlier.
The Mannheim model.
Yes, where boundaries are drawn inductively, based on actual events, not just these arbitrary, preordained mathematical cycles.
Okay. Before we get into the specific generations we all know, I want to touch on this idea of generational tension. It seems like we're always hearing about how the generations don't get along, the boomers think this, the millennials do that.
This is a core part of the theory. Norman Ryder, writing in the American Sociological Review way back in 1965, addressed this directly.
What did he say?
He noted that generations can be a threat to stability. Every new cohort brings new ideas that challenge the old ways.
But he didn't see that as a bad thing.
No. He also argued they represent an opportunity for social transformation.
So the tension is actually necessary for change. If the young always agreed with the old, society would just be stuck in a loop.
In many ways, yes. New cohorts are the engine of change. More recently, Amanda Grenier, in a 2007 essay, added another layer to this.
What was her take?
She argued that tensions also arise from different linguistic models and communication styles between cohorts.
So it's not just about values, it's about the language we use.
It's about different ways of speaking, different assumptions in communication, which contribute to the misunderstanding.
That explains a lot of the workplace friction we read about. It's not just values, it's literally how people talk to each other. Okay, let's walk through the biography of these Western cohorts. We hear these names all the time, but let's anchor them in the events, the imprints that define them. We should start with the lost generation.
The lost generation. It's sometimes called the generation of 1914 in Europe. This cohort was born roughly from 1883 to 1900.
And the term itself came from Gertrude Stein, right?
Yes, she's credited with coining it, and it was popularized by Ernest Hemingway in his writing.
And their defining event, their imprint, was World War I.
Unquestionably. World War I and then the Roaring Twenties that followed. This was a generation that was absolutely decimated by war. They saw the horrors of trench warfare, the collapse of old empires.
And then they were just thrust into a period of rapid social change and excess in the 1920s. It must have been whiplash.
It created a generation defined by a sense of disillusionment and cynicism. They saw the old virtues of the Victorian era lead to the pointless slaughter of millions. So when they came home, many of them rejected those values entirely.
Following them, we have the greatest generation, also known as the GI generation.
Born from 1901 to 1927. These are, of course, the veterans of World War II.
And it's interesting to note the split here.
There is a split. The older members of this cohort came of age during the Roaring Twenties, so they saw that excess. But the younger members came of age during the Great Depression.
But the unifying factor, the great imprint for all of them, was the Second World War.
That was the defining shared experience. They are often characterized by their work in institution building. They survived the Depression, they won the war, and then they came home to build the modern economy. There's a sense of civic duty and collective effort associated with them.
Then comes a smaller group, the silent generation.
They're often called the lucky few, born from 1928 to 1945.
Why, lucky few.
Relative to the generations before and after, they experienced a period of relative prosperity and stability in their young adult years. They came of age in the post-World War II era.
So they were too young for World War II, but old enough to establish themselves before the turmoil of the 60s.
In the U.S., this group includes those who fought in the Korean War and many who fought in Vietnam. They're often described as silent because they were squeezed between two very loud, very large generations. The GIs and the boomers.
And they tended to work within the system rather than trying to burn it down.
That's the general characterization, yes.
And then, perhaps the most discussed generation of the 20th century.
The baby boomers. Born from 1946 to 1964, this generation is defined demographically by the massive post-war spike in birth rates. It's a huge cohort, which is part of why they've had such a large cultural impact.
But again, there is a split. It's not one monolithic group.
Not at all. The older boomers participated in the counterculture of the 1960s Woodstock, the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement. Those events were their imprint.
But the younger boomers...
The younger boomers, sometimes called Generation Jones, came of age in the malaise years of the 1970s. The oil crisis, Watergate, economic uncertainty, a very different formative experience.
That split is so important. A boomer born in 1947 was at Woodstock. A boomer born in 1961 was in elementary school during Woodstock. Their experiences are totally different. Then we bend Generation X.
Born between 1965 and 1980.
My generation, actually.
In the U.S., they were sometimes called the baby bust generation.
Because the birth rates dropped significantly after the boom.
Correct. They were also famously known as the MTV generation.
We were.
That was due to the channel's immense popularity and influence during your formative years. Also, social changes like the rise of divorce rates and more women entering the workforce led to the latchkey kid phenomenon.
A lot of us came home to an empty house.
And that created a reputation for independence, resourcefulness, and a certain skepticism of institutions.
Then come the millennials, also known as Generation Y.
Born from 1981 to 1996, they grew up, of course, around the turn of the millennium.
And what were their imprints?
Their formative years were marked by a few huge events. The rise of the public internet, the September 11th attacks, which reshaped geopolitics, and the 2008 financial crisis, which hit many of them just as they were entering the workforce.
So a mix of technological optimism and then economic and political shocks.
A very potent combination. And a significant demographic milestone occurred in 2019.
What was that?
Millennials officially outnumbered baby boomers in the United States for the first time.
That really is a shifting of the guard. And following them, Generation Z.
The Zoomers, born from 1997 to 2012. These are the true digital natives. They have never known a world without the internet or mobile phones.
And their formative years are being shaped right now.
By the global pandemic, by concerns over climate change, by a very polarized political environment.
And finally, the newest kids on the block, Generation Alpha.
Researchers identified the early 2010s to the mid-2020s as their birth range. They are the first generation to be born entirely in the 21st century.
Now that is the Western timeline. It's the one that Hollywood movies and American marketing firms focus on.
It is.
But if we go back to Mannheim's theory that a generation is defined by location and specific history, then it stands to reason that different countries must have different generations.
They must.
You can't have a baby boomer in a country that didn't have a post-war baby boom.
Precisely. Mannheim's theory implies that the global validity of terms like Gen X or millennial is extremely limited. You have to look at local history.
So let's do that. Let's look at South Africa, for example. The defining event there in the late 20th century was obviously the end of apartheid.
Absolutely. And that gives rise to the born-free generation.
Born free.
People born after the first multiracial democratic election in 1994. They grew up without the legal system of apartheid. Their imprint is freedom, though they still navigate the economic and social legacy of that past.
And there's a newer term there as well.
More recently, yes. They have a cohort known as AMA 2000.
AMA 2000, what does that mean?
It refers to those born after the year 2000. The term was actually popularized by pop music and a Coca-Cola advertisement.
So it's a cultural marker.
Yes, and it's often associated with a free-spirited, sometimes rule-breaking attitude that contrasts with the perceived seriousness of the older generations who fought against apartheid.
Let's move to Israel. The defining event there for the mid-20th century is, well, it's obvious.
The Holocaust. In Israel, the term second generation, or dorshini, has a very specific meaning.
It's not just the generation after.
No. It specifically refers to the children of Holocaust survivors. It's not just a time marker. It is a profound psychological marker.
And the research around this group is very specific.
It focuses heavily on transgenerational trauma, the study of how the trauma of the parents is passed down, consciously or unconsciously, to the children.
That is a heavy but incredibly important distinction. It shows how generation can be about shared pain, a shared psychic wound, not just shared pop culture. What about Eastern Europe? The story there is shaped by communism and its collapse.
Very much so. In the Czech Republic and Slovakia, for instance, you have Husak's children.
Named after a person.
Yes. Gustav Husak, the communist leader of Czechoslovakia in the 1970s. This generation was born during a baby boom in the early 70s.
Was that a natural boon?
No, it was initiated by his specific pro-natalist policies. The state offered financial incentives to encourage people to have more children. So the generation itself is a product of state policy.
And Romania has a similar, though perhaps a darker version of this.
A much darker version, the decree.
The decree.
These are the children born after 1967, specifically after Decree 770 was enacted.
And what did that decree do?
It restricted abortion and contraception for most women in an attempt to force population growth under the dictator Nicolae Ceausescu.
So this entire generation is defined by a specific coercive government policy regarding reproduction.
Yes. And because many families couldn't afford to keep the children they were forced to have, many of these decree grew up in horrifically underfunded state orphanages. It's a generation defined by the state's violent intervention in the family.
Russia also defines its generations by these massive historical pivots.
Russian generations are almost entirely defined by what they call fateful events. You have the generation of winners, in reference to World War II. You have the Cold War generation.
And then the collapse of the Soviet Union.
That created the children of perestroika who watched the world they knew dissolve. And following them, you have the first non-Soviet generation who have no memory of that system at all.
It really highlights how political stability, or the lack of it, shapes how we see ourselves in time. Let's look at Asia. China has undergone just a massive transformation in the last 50 years.
An almost unprecedented transformation. And they use terms like post-80s, Balinghu, and post-90s.
And the post-80s generation is defined by what?
By being born after the implementation of the one-child policy in 1979.
That has to create a unique psychological profile, a whole generation of only children.
It does. This cohort is characterized by a mix of things. On one hand, optimism and a newfound excitement for consumerism as China opened up. But on the other hand, immense pressure. They face what's known as the 4-to-1 problem.
4-to-1, what is that?
4 grandparents, 2 parents, 1 child. As that single child grows up, they become the sole financial and emotional provider for 2 aging parents and potentially 4 grandparents with no siblings to share that burden.
It's an inverted pyramid of responsibility.
A staggering amount of pressure placed on one individual.
South Korea also has very political definitions for its generations.
South Korea is fascinating. They have the 386 generation.
Now, is that a computer reference? It sounds like an old processor.
It is. It's named after the Intel 386 computer, which was common in the 1990s when the term was coined. But the code itself describes the people.
How so?
People who were in their 30s at the time were born in the 1960s and attended college in the 1980s.
Ah, so the numbers 3, 6, 8 align with the demographic data.
Correct. And this generation was central to the pro-democracy movement that overthrew the military dictatorship. They are a highly political generation.
And in contrast to them,
You have the Shinsi-dae, the new generation who came after. They are seen as being free from that intense ideological struggle and more focused on consumption, individualism, and global culture.
Taiwan has a particularly colorful name for one of its cohorts, the strawberry generation.
Born after 1981, and the stereotype is that they bruise easily, just like strawberries.
So it's not a compliment.
Not at all. They are perceived by the older generation as being unable to withstand social pressure or work as hard as their parents did, who built Taiwan's economic miracle.
You know, we hear similar complaints about younger generations in the West, calling them snowflakes. It seems the kids these days are too soft. Complaint is a universal one.
It appears to be a recurring theme in generational discourse, yes.
And Singapore.
Singapore has the pioneer generation, those born before 1949 who helped build the nation from scratch, and the Merdeka generation.
Merdeka.
It means independence in Malay. They were born between 1950 and 1959, and their formative years coincided with the political turbulence of achieving self-governance and then independence.
I want to zoom in now on the spaces between these big blocks, the microgenerations, because sometimes you're born right on the edge and you don't really fit the big label.
We call these people cuspers. They're on the cusp between 2 major generations. A prime example is Generation Jones.
Who is Jones? Is that a person?
No, it's not a person. The name refers to the idea of keeping up with the Joneses and a certain jonesing or craving for the optimism of the 1960s that they just missed.
Now, who does this cover?
Roughly 1954 to 1965. These are the younger boomers. They missed Woodstock. They didn't experience the summer of love. They got the economic malaise of the 1970s and the oil crisis. Their experience is vastly different from the boomers born in 1946.
Then you have the Ennials.
Late 1970s to the early 1980s, they're sometimes called the Oregon Trail generation.
After the computer game. I remember that.
Exactly. It's the perfect name for them. They had an analog childhood, but a digital adulthood.
So they bridged the gap between Gen X and millennials. They remember using a card catalog in a library, but they also adapted very quickly to the internet.
That's the idea. And you see a similar microgeneration with Zillennials catching the tail end of the millennials and the start of Gen Z. But there are also terms that describe cultural movements, not just birth dates.
The Beat Generation, for example.
Right. That was a specific cultural movement, primarily in the 1940s and 50s. It wasn't everyone born then, just a specific subset of counterculture figures like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg.
There's one term, though, that uses the word generation. in a way that is far removed from marketing or pop culture, and it's important we acknowledge it. The stolen generations in Australia.
Yes. This refers to the children of Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent who were forcibly removed from their families
By the government.
by Australian federal and state government agencies and church missions. This occurred over a very long period, approximately between 1869 and 1969.
A century of forced removal.
It is a truly tragic use of the word, and it highlights the difference in how the word can be applied. It marks a deliberate, violent disruption of the familial generation we discussed at the very start. It broke the line of descent and cultural transmission.
It's a completely different meaning. We also see economic conditions creating generation names. In Norway, they talk about the desert generation.
An interesting term. It's applied to baby boomers and everyone who came after them.
And the implication is?
The implication is that they have lived a life of desert, a life of luxury and ease compared to the hardship of their ancestors who built the country's wealth from things like oil.
Meanwhile, in Southern Europe, the economic picture created a very, very different label.
A much bleaker one. In Greece, Italy, and Spain, you have terms like the generation of 500 euros or 1,000 euros. In Spain, they're known as the Milleristas.
A name that describes their salary cap.
Exactly. It describes a generation of young people who, despite often being highly educated, are forced into precarious, underpaid employment where they cannot earn more than about 1,000 euros a month. It defines the generation by its economic stagnation.
This leads us then to the big question, the so what of this whole discussion. We've traced this concept from 1863 to today. We've looked at the global variations, but is this science? Or is it just horoscopes for large groups of people?
There is significant criticism along those lines. Philip N. Cohen, a sociology professor at the University of Maryland, wrote a very pointed open letter to the Pew Research Center about this very issue.
Pew Research, who are one of the main bodies that popularized these definitions, what was his argument?
He argued that these generation labels are largely arbitrary, that they are imposed by survey researchers and marketers, and he believes they drive people toward stereotyping and rash character judgment.
He called them clickbait, I think.
He suggested they have become clickbait rather than a tool for serious social science.
Louis Menand at The New Yorker had a similar take.
Menand pointed out that there is essentially no empirical basis for the core contention of generational theory.
Which is?
The idea that differences within a generation are smaller than differences between them.
Right. Does a person born in 1964, technically a boomer, really have more in common with a boomer born in 1946 than they do with a Gen X person born just 1 year later in 1965?
Empirically, probably not. The line is arbitrary. A person born in 1964 shares much more cultural DNA, you could say, with someone born in 1965 than with someone born 18 years prior. The arbitrary cutoff dates create these false divisions.
And this criticism, this pushback, it actually led to a major change recently.
It did, a very significant one. In 2023, the Pew Research Center, which, as you said, has been a major driver of these definitions for years, announced a pivot.
What was the pivot?
They stated that they would change how they use generation labels going forward, specifically to avoid reinforcing harmful stereotypes.
So what are they doing instead? Are they just abandoning the whole idea?
Not abandoning it, but refining it. They are now focusing on age cohort analysis.
Age cohort analysis.
This means comparing, for example, 25-year-olds today to 25-year-olds in 1980. This allows for an accurate tracking of social change over time without loading it with the personality baggage and stereotypes of a label like millennial or boomer.
So they're comparing age to age rather than label to label.
Precisely. It's a more rigorous and less sensational way to study social change.
It seems we are coming full circle. We started with biological families. We moved to these broad social cohorts to try and understand the rapid changes of the Industrial Revolution. And now we're questioning if those labels have become too rigid, too commercialized, and frankly, too reductive.
It's the natural evolution of a sociological tool. It served a purpose to explain mass industrial change, but as society becomes more fragmented and individualistic, the broad brush of generation may be losing its precision and its usefulness.
It's just a fascinating biography of an idea. It shows that even the words we use to describe our own place in time have a history, a birth, and perhaps an evolution into something new. It frames how we see our parents, our children, and ultimately ourselves.
And it reminds us that while we are undoubtedly shaped by our times, we are not wholly defined by them. The individual still matters.
I think that is the perfect place to leave it. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the concept of generations.
It was a pleasure to analyze the data with you.
And to you, listening, thanks for listening.